Okay, let's begin. All right. So on Monday, we introduce while loop, which is another way to write iterations. So the iterations is not iterate over some iterables, rather it's iterate because of a certain conditions. So we need to define what is this condition is. So as long as this condition is true, you're going to repeat this block of statements. So the way it works is that it will first check whether the condition is true. If it's true, you're going to repeat this statement, and then you're going to go back and check the condition again. So we're going to repeat this process again and again until the condition returns false, then you exit the while loop. Okay, and in the video recording for Monday, we have also seen that we can use break to exit whatever loop it is. So we have seen that we can use break to exit immediately in for loop. So the same thing happened in while loop. You can also use break to exit as well. So once you execute the line break, everything remaining will not be executed. It will be immediately out of the loop, whether it's while loop or for loop. Okay, so for while loop, usually it will not be recommended to use break. But sometimes for easy implementations, people still use break in a while loop. So it's completely fine. So what we don't want to see, or what developers in the programming world didn't like to see, is that there are so many breaks inside while loop. And for our course, because our code is simple, so easy to find out when it's going to break. But for large code, if the developer have to read through the while loop to find out when it's going to break, then it's going to take some time. So usually we want it such that the while loop condition itself already tell us when it's going to continue run, when it's going to be break. Okay, so basically use break sparingly. Okay, so this is just a practice, a normal practice among the programmers. Okay, now so and then we study what's the difference between for loop and while loop. So we have two different loops. One is while and one is for. Which one to know? Which one to use? Okay. So one thing that we started off with for loop, and we say that we needed another loop because for loop we need to know the number of iterations. While for while loop we don't have to know the number of iterations. It can take unbounded number of iterations, and both can end early while break, as we have seen examples. And one thing, for loop, it uses a counter, but this is an internal counter. Okay, so for while loop, on the other hand, we need to create this counter ourselves. It must be initialized before loop and incremented inside the loop. Okay, so in your condition, usually there is a way. Usually it comes with a variable, and that variable is sort of your counter. Okay, and that variable is such that it must be initialized before the while loop start. All right, and if you want your while loop to execute at least one, then the initialized value must be such that the condition is true for the first time. And inside the while loop itself, the block of statements, you should update the value of the counter just so that it won't go infinite times if this is not what you want. However, we have also seen an example where you can use while true. Well, in this case, this is always going to be true. So just looking at the first sentence, it appears that it's going to run forever. And for such problems, for such statements, you usually will expect a break somewhere because you don't want it to run infinite times. Okay, so while true, and then somewhere you say there is a statement for which it's going to break. All right. Now, just to demonstrate one thing. So for loop, you can rewrite using while loop. So every for loop can be rewritten using while loop. So the idea is pretty much that for every counter that when you use for loop, you require to declare the counter over some iterables. So when you write a while loop, you're going to use that counter you're going to write the counter explicitly in your while loop. So every for loop can be rewritten using while loop, but not every while loop can be rewritten using for loop. Okay, especially those while loop for which there are unbounded number of iterations, then you can't use for loop. So let's look at an example of how to translate for loop to while loop. Okay, so this is one simple code for I in range 3, print I. So at every single iteration, I takes a new value, starting from 0, the next value will be 1 and 2. And so every single iteration, you print the value of I. And to rewrite using while loop, so we need to declare this ourselves. Okay, we start with I equals to 0, and it's going to keep running as long as I is less than 3. And then you print I, and remember, you need to update the value of I. So what is the updated value of I? It will be the next value, next I in our iteration. And our next I value will be 1 plus the previous value. So we'll have I plus equals to 1. So now they both give the same result. So this is how you translate from for loop to while loop. Now, sometimes when we write for loop, we also have something like this for x in a list or for x in a string, for example. These lists and strings, they are iterables. All right, x is a variable that will take the value of the individual elements in this list here. So the first time x will be y, x will be 1, and then the second iteration, x will be 3, and the third iteration, x will be 4. Okay, so in this case, how do we translate it into while loop? Okay, so earlier on, if you use the previous example, we just put I equals to 0. As long as I is less than 3, you increase it by 1, because this is what it iterates over with. Now, what about this? Should I put x equals to 1? But here's the thing. If you have to do it manually, then it's no longer program. Okay, you can't, there is no certain pattern here that x equals to 1. The next value is 3. So what is the difference between them, and how do we automate this? So we can't really do x equals to 1 here. So what is the implicit counter? So remember, the counter is not the element. Okay, for loop, the internal counter is actually starting from 0. It represents the indices. Okay, so I'm going to write it here. So the internal counter of for loop starts with 0 and ends with length of the list minus 1. So basically, essentially, the internal counter, so this is a list, or it could be any iterables. Depends on what you iterate or work with. Okay, the internal counter represents the indices. All right, so for x is equals to 1 in the first round, x equals to 3 in the second round, and x equals to 4 in the third round. However, behind the scene, there is something called internal counter that is start from 0 and ends with the number of elements in the list, which is the length of the list minus 1. So because you start from 0, this will iterate through all the indices over the iterables that you iterate with. Okay, so this is the internal counter that we need to make when we write our while loop. Okay, so we're gonna iterate over the indices. Okay, when we rewrite it using while loop. By mimicking the for loop, but iterate over the indices. All right, so we start with I equals to 0. That would be my first index. Okay, and while I less than the maximum index, or actually while I less than the length of the list. So in this case, suppose I have my list equals to 1, 3, 4. Okay, and while it's less than the length of the list, all right, then that means there is still an index. That means this I here is still a valid index. So as long as I is less than length of L, then I is an index that we can access. Okay. All right, so what do? It's say print x. Okay, so this is what we want to repeat, print x. But what is x actually? X is actually the value at index I of the list. So the value at index I of the list will be L of I. Okay, So L of I, which means the element at the I index of L will be the value X here. Okay, so this is how you translate this for loop into a while loop. Okay, so at this moment, is it the end? So I want you to run it and tell me what's going to be issue here. So you can see here, it's going to go 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Now, can you tell me what happened here? I'm going to stop it first. All right, it's going to print all the one, which is not what we want. We wanted to print every element in the list, and we write using while loop. Okay, so what is the issue here? When do we break? So one thing you have to remember, this is a condition, right? This condition involves the variable I. This variable I has to be initialized, and we initialize to equal to 0. So as long as I is less than length of L, we're gonna print the elements at index I of L. So what is the thing that I always ask you to think about? A variable has to be updated. So it's not updated here. How should I update here? So we start off with I equals to 0. It will access the 0 index of L. The next element that I want to access will be the 1 index of L, and then subsequent index of L. So I will be I plus equals to 1. So this is the same as I equals to I plus 1. Okay, so initially I equals to 0. 0 is less than, in this case, 3. Length of L is 3. So you will print 0 index of L, the element at 0 index of L, which is 1. All right, and then you will increase I by 1. So I will become 1 now, and you will go back to line 4. Now 1 again is less than 3. So you print the element at 1, index 1 of L, and then you increase I by 1 again. So now I is equals to 2. Now 2 is less than 3 again. So you print the element at index 2 of L, and then you increase I again to 3, and then you go back and test. And this time 3 is not less than 3, and you exit the loop. Okay, now we have all the elements of the list. Okay, so it's very, very important. You have a condition here. Okay, if you set your initial value such that it will run once, all right, you must make sure that if you don't want it to run forever, the value of I has to be updated so that the conditions will be able to be forced at one point so that it's not going to run forever. Does it make sense? Okay, now when to use for loop and when to use while loop. So we give a general rule. If you know the number of iterations, so it's easier if you actually write it using for loop because everything is done for you. The internal counter is taking care of everything for you. It's taking care of what is the start value. It's taking care of how it's going to update it, and how many iterations. What is the maximum number of iterations going to be? But if you have to write it yourself, then first you have to initialize the counter yourself. You have to state what is the condition for it to end, and you have to do the update. Okay. So the general rule of thumb is that if you know the number of iterations, it's easier to just write using for loop. Okay. Now let's look at a couple of scenarios here for which we want to write iterations to solve this problem. And we decide whether it's easier to use for loop or it's easier to use while loop. So we have asked to create a simple addition calculator that asks user for input of 3 integers and display the sum of these integers value. Assume user enter integers. Okay, so I put 3 here. It could be any number of integers. I just want to write a simple code here. Okay, let's look at scenario 1. So for scenario 1, so let's look at these questions here. You ask that you're going to ask user for input of 3 integers and display the sum of these values and assume users enter integers. Okay, so this is easy. So you have only 3 values. Okay, so we have value 1 equals to input, enter an integer. All right, and because we assume that it always enter as user always enter integers, I can do type cuts immediately. Okay, and because it has only 3 value, so it's this easy. I will just do 3 variable, value 1, 2, 3, ask user to enter integers, and then print the sum of the 3 input integers is value 1 plus value 2 plus value 3. Okay, so you first ask user to input an integer, and then second integer, third integers, and then you display. Now this is because it's 3 integers, so you kind of think that it's okay to write this way. Now, what if we extend it to any number of integers? Okay, a given number of integers. Okay, say n is equals to 10. Right, so suppose you must ask user to enter 10 integers. Now in this case, I don't want to write explicitly 10 times of this. I don't want to have value 4. I don't want to write a value 5 and so on. So how do I write about it? And this n here can change. Okay, this n here can change for different purposes. Okay, for example, if the number of quizzes from 12 to 13, then I don't want to continue adding it to for value 1, 2, 3 all the way to value 13. So this is the case that we know we are doing repetition here. We keep asking user for input. All right, and we know it's gonna ask user for 10 input. All right, so this is where we're gonna use for loops. We're gonna iterate using for loop because we know exactly or what is the maximum number of iterations that will be required. In this case, it will be 10, which will be this value n here. Okay, so I'm gonna do for I in range n, and then I'm gonna do value equals to enter an integer. This is what is gonna be repeated. Okay, all right, and for each time you get a value, you need to add it into something. And this is where I have a variable called sum equals to 0. So this represents the sum of integers user has entered so far. At the beginning, it's initialized to 0 because user has not entered anything. Now, once user has entered something, and I type this into int and store it in the variable called value here, I'm going to add it into my sum. So now sum plus equals to value. Okay, this means adding the value to sum. So at every iteration, you add a value input by the user into the sum. So sum will represent the total number of integers that user has entered so far at that iteration. All right, and in the end, you're gonna print, so the sum of say n input integers is something where you use dot format. So this will be n, and this will be my sum. Okay, so here's a running example. Say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So the sum of 10 input integers is 55. Okay, so now I want to mention something very quickly. It's not exactly important. It's not really programming. I want to make a point here. So this part here, where you ask user to sum of integers, here for I in range of n. So if you want to do it using while loop, it's completely possible. Okay, so it is possible to rewrite it using while loop. Okay, and exercise by yourself is to rewrite it using while loop. Again, this is very simple. We start off with I equals to 0. Okay, I'm gonna give you an example. So this is just extra. If you can write it using for loop, why not? But if you want to rewrite as a practice using while loop, so again, it's simple. You mimic the for loop iterations. So you start off with I equals to 0. Now, while I is less than n, you ask user for a value. You sum plus equals to value. And don't forget, you have to increase the value of I. In this case, you increase the value of I by 1. All right? And this is how you change from for loop to while loop. Now, let's go to scenario 2, where you are asked to create a simple calculator, again, an addition calculator. They ask user for input of integers and display the sum of these values, and users enter quick to stop. Now, okay, scenario 2. So the scenario 1 is that you are given, okay, the number of input integers are given. That's the scenario 1. Either it's 3 or it's a 10 or some variable that is set to the number of given integers. All right. Now in scenario 2, okay, the number of input integers is not known. Instead, the user enter what is this? Quick to stop. To stop further inputs. All right, now in this case, because we don't know the number of input integers, all right, so we can't use for loop because I actually really don't know. Until user hit stop, I have to keep on asking user for input. So I need to start the iteration already before I know how many integers the user gonna have to input. And in that case, I can only use while loop. All right. So in this case, so for while loop, it's required. All right, and what is the structure of while loop? We need the condition for which it will continue to run. What is the thing that I want to run? What is the block of statements that I want to run? Now, in this case, the block of statements that I want to keep asking user, that I want to keep on repeat is ask user for input and add user input into the sum. So sum is a variable that represents the sum or the total input integers user has typed so far, initialized to 0. All right, and what is the conditions? We will keep asking user, and we will keep on adding user input. I will keep on asking user for input and keep on adding user input into the sum as long as user does not enter quit. All right, so we have all the elements that we need to write while loop, and here's gonna start. Okay, so I'm gonna borrow some of this code here. All right, so we're gonna do first sum is equal to 0. Okay, so while user input is not equals to quit, as long as it's not quit, I'm gonna repeat this statement where I'm gonna ask user for input and I'm gonna do sum plus equals to value. So we should have value here. But here's a few things that you need to be taken care of very carefully. So you do a typecast here. So you assume user enter an integer. You can only do that if you assume, but we allow user to enter quit. So this is where you need to stop and think. That means I can't make this assumption. All right, so we're gonna have to look at our task again. Okay, we need to make a different assumption. Okay, so say we assume user enters either quit or an integer. All right, so now in this case, I will have user input here. Okay, so user input not necessarily is a value. It could be a string now. It doesn't have to be integer, so we can't do typecast. All right. All right, and we're gonna do typecast here. So we're gonna first ask user for input. First ask user for an input. All right, now as long as user input is not equals to quit, so then we typecast the user input. All right, and then we add it into sum, and then we ask user for an input again. Okay, and at the end, we're gonna print the sum of all input integers is just sum. Okay. So as long you ask user first for input, as long as it's not equals to quit, you add that user input. You first typecast it, add it into sum, and then you ask user input again. All right. So let's run this pretty quickly. So I have 1, 2, 3, and then I decided I want to stop. So I type quit, and you say that the sum of all input integers is 6. All right. So this is how we use while loop to add numbers in our case. And this is necessary to use while loop because we actually don't know number of iterations. Now let's look at the third scenario. Again, you have a simple addition calculator, ask user for input of 3 integers, and display the sum of these values. If any point user input is not an integer, you keep asking user input until user input is an integer. So in this case, we remove the assumption that user always input an integer. Okay, and so here's the thing. So we basically remove the assumption that, so essentially we remove the assumption that user always enter an integer. So when we remove this assumption, so then we need to take care of this. What happens if user enters something that is not integer? Now, the way this program works is that if user does not enter an integer, then we keep asking users to input until it is an integer. All right. And so we have 2 loops here. So suppose it's 10 integers. Okay, not 3. Suppose it's 10. Because 3 is easy. I can just write value 1, 2, 3. Okay. So let's just write 10 integers. Okay, so the first part here where you ask user for 10 integers, we know that we can run using for loop. We have seen scenario 1. Okay, when you ask user for 10 integers and add it up, this can be done using for loop. So we know that, use a for loop to run that 10 iterations. That iterations here is to sum or is to take user input that is an integer. Okay, each of these iterations is such that it takes input that is integer and add it to sum. Okay, now again, so recall that sum is 0, is initialized to 0, and it represents the total integers user has entered so far. Okay, now again, this is 10 iteration using for loop, assuming user enters an integer. Okay, now in the event that user does not enter an integer, so again, we will keep asking user to input until an integer is obtained. So in this case, we don't know how many times the user will finally think that, okay, he's asking for a whole number, not a decimal number. It has to be an integer. It cannot be an alphabet. So he finally realized that, but we don't know how many times it's going to require for the user to realize that. So we will require to use a while loop. So we're going to use a while loop. Okay. So we're going to use a while loop for this case. Okay. Use a while loop in the event that the user does not enter an integer. All right. So how do we do this? So we have both for loops and while loops. So let's start. Okay. So we have for I in range of 10. Okay. And we know that we need some sum here, which is equal to 0 at the beginning. And we have user input equals to input, enter an integer. Okay. Now, if you assume that the user input is when user input is integer, okay, you're gonna add the value, okay, add sum will be equals to sum plus int of user input. All right, so you add the integer value of user input into sum. Now this now we need to take care of the case. Okay. So as long as user input is not integer, we need to keep asking user for input. All right, this is where we're going to use while loop here. So while user input is not integer, so user input is not integer. All right, so this is not the code yet. This is something we're going to fix later. We're going to set the structure first. As long as user input is not integer, we're going to keep asking user for input again. Okay, so the while loop will end when the user input is finally an integer. When it's finally an integer, we can do typecast and add it into sum. And in the end, we're going to print the sum of all integers is the value sum. Okay, so now we're going to fix this. How do we check whether user input is not integer? Okay, so again, we can use the isDigit format. Okay, so we're going to use isDigit. This will return, well, it is not a digit, then you ask user for an input. As long as it's not integer, we ask user for input. So this will return true if it is an integer, and will return false if it's not. So as long as it's not an integer, we're going to ask user for input. All right. So we're here in the example where we have both iterations, while loop inside a for loop here. And of course, you can rewrite this solely using while loop. As I mentioned before, every for loop can be rewritten using while loop. So you can actually rewrite this, the whole thing, just using one while loop without having to have one for loop and then another while loop inside. So it's completely possible, okay? Now, if we want to know how to do this, we can discuss it after the lecture. But for now, I want to discuss a subsequent problem. So scenario which resemble what we want to talk about called calculator version 3. Okay. However, I want to illustrate it using a different scenario. So the supermarket scenario. Okay, so this is an interesting example where suppose you go to a supermarket and you only have a budget of say $10. $100. You have a budget of $100 and you pick some items that you want to purchase. But some of these items you don't know the price. So the only way that you know the price is to go to the cashier and scan the item. So you only have $100 and you have these items that you want to buy. So you know that possibly you can buy all, or you can only pick some of them. So you kind of sort these items into priority, those that you must buy now, and those that is not important if it exceeds the budget, so you just don't buy those items. So you're going to give to the cashier one by one in the order of priority, which one that you want to be considered to buy within the budget. Okay, so here's the thing. So the cashier will pick up this item one by one, is scan it. Once it's scanned, it will show the price, okay? And then you pick up the second item, it will scan it again, and it will immediately add the price of the scanned item into the sum of the total values that you have obtained so far, okay? So every single time the cashier pick an item, is scanned, it adds the price of the item into the sum. So as a user, you see the amount that you are actually supposed, the amount of the price of the total items that you have, the cashier has scanned so far, okay? So once you see that the value exceed 100, you ask the cashier to stop. This is already beyond my budget, it has to stop now. And then of course, you still just have $100, so you're gonna take out the last item that you have added that caused it to exceed $100, and so that the total items that you eventually buy is still within budget. So we're gonna make this scenario here, okay? So the idea is we're gonna use while loop, okay? So while certain budget, so you have a certain budget, say you have $100, okay? And you have a sum which is equal to 0. So this will represent the total price of items that have been scanned. by the cashier. All right. So how do we do our conditions here? So you ask the cashier to stop as long as once it reach the budget, exceed the budget. Okay. So here the conditions is that once the value of sum exceeds the budget, you stop. Stop scanning. Okay. Or suppose all the items has already been scanned and is still within the budget. Okay, then of course you also stop because that's the end of the items. Okay, or the number of items, or you have exhausted all the items and all the items are already scanned. All the items are scanned and still within the budget. All right, so we need a stopping value. So the moment all the items has already scanned, you need, for example, the cashier will press enter saying that it's done. Okay, so we need a stopping value, so we can mimic it using a break. So we can mimic it using a stopping value of, say, done. Okay, so it's done, finish scanning. Okay, so there are two conditions here. So what are the conditions for each to continue scan? So the block of code here is to ask user for input. So this will make the scanning procedure. Okay, when you scan, you have a value which is represent the price of the items. And what are the conditions that you keep asking for input is that the sum is still less than budget, or less than or equals to budget. As long as the sum, the total value that it has been scanned is still less than or equals to budget, you stop. You keep asking user for input. Okay. Or and it is not quick. And it is not done yet. Okay, it is not done yet. There are still items that need to be scanned, and the sum is still less than or equal to budget. Then you keep asking user for input. So here's what we're gonna do. So we're gonna ask user input equals to something first, and while user input is not equals to done, and the sum is less than or equals to budget. Okay, as long as it's not done, as long as the sum is not is less than or equal to budget, you keep asking user for input. Okay. All right, and also remember, so we assume user always enter integer because it's a scanning machine. All right. Actually, no, we can't do that because we allow user input to be a done here. Okay. Here. All right. So we're gonna add it first. We're gonna sum again. We use what we have earlier, int of user input. All right. Again, we make the assumptions. So assumption is that user enters either integer or done. Okay, this is easily done in the scanner machine. It can be either digits or you just press enter, means it's done. Okay, so you sum plus equals to the int of user input, and then we ask user input again. Okay, so we need to put here. All right, and in the end, we're gonna print. So before that, okay, you have to do one scenario here. If the sum exceeds the budget, then we need to minus the last item, the price of the last item. Okay, that is only when the sum exceeds the budget. If the sum is not exceed the budget, the items that you have scanned, all of them can be bought. If the last item is the one that caused it to exceed the budget, then you need to minus the price of that last item. So we need another if statement here. So if the sum is more than the budget, okay, then you need to say you need to minus that amount, which is int of user input. So this will store the last user input, and you want to minus the int cast the type cast value of this user input. Okay. Otherwise, you keep the value of sum. So you keep all the items that have been scanned. So print the total amount to pay is sum. Okay. So can try to execute it. So all of these codes will be available on D2L as well. Okay. So I hope these scenarios give you an idea of what it needs to be done when you write a while loop. Okay. And also next time you go to supermarket, you can think about this process here, and it helps you to understand the while loop better. All right, thank you. And we're gonna start the quiz now.